So today we come to one of the most famous chapters in the book of Daniel. That is Daniel chapter 6. Now, in the last chapter, we saw that the Babylonian kingdom has just fallen. And and now there's the rise of a new kingdom, and that is the Median and Persian kingdom. Now, if you remember that King Nebuchadnezzar had seen a dream, and in that dream there was a tall statue, and in the statue there was different pieces of metal, with the head being gold, signifying Babylon, and then there were arms and the chest made of silver, and that was supposed to be the Median and Persian kingdom, and that kingdom would be a less powerful kingdom than Nebuchadnezzar's. So here we see the Median and Persian kingdom come to power under Darius. So it verse 1 says that it seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and owe them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. So here we see in these opening verses that when Darius came to be ruler over the Babylonian kingdom, he appointed 120 satraps over the kingdom. Now, who are these satraps? They were the protectors of the kingdom, like the local guys who would take care of the day-to-day, affairs of the portion of the kingdom allotted to them. So here we see that Darius, he did not hold all the power to himself. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he was ruling the kingdom, one person with all the power. So this kingdom that we saw earlier would be the arms and chest made of silver. So here we see 120 satraps are made, are installed. And then over the 120 satraps, there are 3 commissioners. And this was the structure that Darius put in place in his first year of arrival. And as we see in those top 3 people, Daniel was one of the high officials or commissioners. Now, these 120 satraps had to give an account to these top 3 guys, and one of them was Daniel. And it was why the reason also mentioned over here, so that the king might not suffer any loss. So, Daniel, probably now he's in his 80s, and he had earlier prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar that, about he, saved he he was in touch with the gods, the living God. So he was installed because he could interpret dreams, and he had over time become one of the most trusted prophets of that age. So he's there so that in case there is any political pressure from any other kingdom or within the kingdom, Daniel would have the wisdom to figure out what to do. Or if there was something else going on in the kingdom, something bad going to happen, then Daniel would be there to take care of matters. So therefore Daniel, we see Daniel, he's in the top 3 governors of Darius's kingdom. So then in verse 3 it says that then Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So in no time, we see that Daniel, even though he was in the top 3 people, he was climbing up his ranks even over there, because Daniel was a guy who was in touch with the living God. And because of that, Darius was impressed with Daniel, and he was about to be given the whole kingdom to rule over. So that is what verse 3 actually tells us. Then in verse 4 and 5, we see that then the commissioners and the satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could not find no ground of accusation or evidence or corruption, in as much as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." So now, once Daniel is the head of the kingdom, it becomes clear that probably the king is showing him so much favor that the other officials and satraps are jealous of Daniel, and they want to turn the king against Daniel. So they could not find any fault against Daniel. Daniel was living such a life that nobody could point a finger against him. But just as in, in chapter 3, verses 8 to 12, we see the Chaldeans, they brought a complaint against the Hebrew boys that they were not bowing down against the image. Here we see that these officials, these jealous officials, even though they could not find no fault with Daniel, they were bound to bring something against them. And why was this? Because their jealousy led them to do such a thing. Now remember this, they knew that Daniel is one of the Hebrew guys picked up from Jerusalem or Judah, and he was not one of the Babylonians, while these guys, they were probably from the Babylonian kingdom, and they were jealous to, have an outsider rule over them. But, at the same time, Daniel is such a religious guy. He had unwavering faith, and that unwavering faith caused them to notice that, if anything they should bring against him, it won't be in his behavior, but against the way he worships his God. So then we see in verses 6, 7, and 8 and 9, it says that these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects, and the satraps, and the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a stature and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. So, what happened with these commissioners and satraps? They all got together and all decided to turn the king's ear against Daniel. We see they all consulted together. They all started making a single plan together to put Daniel, at fault, somebody who was from the land of Judah. They did not like, Daniel being on top of them or, being the boss over them. So what they do is they first come to the king and they try to manipulate him. Now, the thing that they did was they made a commandment that everybody was to worship the king for 30 days. Now this would be really good for the king to hear, because it must have really buttered up the king or flattered him in such a way that he couldn't say no. So this is the plan that they came up with. So for 30 days, all the people would worship Darius. Now, they probably also knew that Daniel, was a praying person. So, they also knew that in these 30 days, Daniel would be praying to his God instead of Darius. So this was a very good idea on their part. In verse 5, it says, that Daniel would remain faithful to the law of his God. So this was, these consp- conspirators, they knew that, Daniel would be obedient to his God. So what they did was they brought a law that says that the king would be worshipped, and the punishment for that was that the person not worshipping the king would be cast into the den of lions, and these satraps and governors were not, the kingdom was huge. These satraps and governors were not uh, worried about the masses. At this moment, they were only worried about Daniel, and they wanted to put him away. So that was the plan. And here we notice in these verses that, the way the laws worked in the Persian and Median Empire was that once it was put down or once it came into enforce, there's nothing that could revoke it. Nothing. Nothing could be done to revoke it. Even if the king changed his mind at the last minute, nothing. Like even if he said, I don't want this law anymore, it couldn't be. A violator was a violator. And these guys, the conspirators, they were going to be successful in manipulating the King Darius. So now in verse 10, we see that verse 10, it says that now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Now, if we look at this narrative, verse 10 is one of the important verses because it tells us the spiritual, discipline that Daniel had throughout his life. Even though he was 80 years old, he was worshiping God, getting down on his knees, calling out to God, and doing it 3 times a day. He used to do it morning, afternoon, and night, praying, giving thanks to his God. And the verse even says that he continued to do as he did previously. So at the beginning of the verse, it says that Daniel knew that the document was signed. Probably, somebody in the kingdom told him, or the king, because Daniel was his favorite, that the king communicated this matter directly to Daniel. It is not known, but somebody communicated the matter, and Daniel knew immediately what was to be done. He's supposed to go to his room, close the door, and pray, call upon his God. And it says that that chamber that he was in had windows, and those windows were towards Jerusalem. Now, in First Kings 8:48, Solomon had prayed that if God's people were exiled and then they repented with all their heart and with all their soul in the land of the enemies who carried them, and if they prayed towards their land, as in they faced their land and prayed, then God would hear them from heaven and forgive them and grant them compassion. So Daniel, he was praying, facing Jerusalem because he knew in his heart of hearts that this, you know, this situation that they were in, it was temporary. Babylonian had been conquered, but the return was, imminent. So we see that, Daniel, he violates the injunction by praying 3 times a day, and the conspirators, informed, Darius that Daniel had violated the injunction. So in verse 11, we see that these men, came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before God. So already these men are in agreement and they said, let's go and see what Daniel is doing. You know, let's see if he's worshiping his God in a time like this. And they were right that Daniel was there. He was worshiping his God. It was difficult for Daniel to not worship his God because he knew the power of, the living God. And Daniel praying 3 times, a day would have been visible to, to the people, to the onlookers. Probably the people could look at Daniel from his chambers and see him praying. Then in verse 12 and 13, it says that then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replied, the statement is true according to the law of Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of your exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. So see this, they come to the King Darius, and they have already manipulated him before, but now they come to him and inquire whether they have actually, understood what the injunction says. And the king says that, uh, yes, the statement is true and it cannot be revoked. Now, the king in all this doesn't know what these guys are trying to do. They're trying to manipulate him. So now they bring the news to the king and they say to the king that Daniel, one of the exiles from Judah, they remind the king who Daniel is, that he's an exile from Judah. He pays no attention to you. So these are the accusations brought to Darius. He pays no attention to the king and he pays no attention to the injunction that the king has signed, but he prays 3 times a day to another god. And these are the accusations that they are bringing to King Darius. So, verse 14 tells us that as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. So imagine this: when King Darius heard that it was Daniel, that it was one of his favorite men in the kingdom who was, doing something against him and something that he couldn't, do anything about. He started, thinking, or he, kept exerting himself, thinking, how will I rescue Daniel? Then these guys in verse 15 remind the king, in verse 15 they say, it says, then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, recognize, O king, that this is a law of Medes and Persians, that no injunction or stature which the king establishes may be changed. So these guys, the conspirators, remind the king of remind the king of the law of the Medes and Persians, that no injunction, may be changed, that nothing can change. So, this time the conspirators are going to get Daniel. That's what they are communicating. And here we see that King Darius also, he cannot do anything because he, according to the law, he cannot even change the law. So the only thing he can do is in verse 16 and 17 says that the king gave orders and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lions. Then the king spoke and said to Daniel, Your God, whom you constantly serve, will deliver you. A stone was brought, laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. So here we see that, bound by the wording of the royal injunction, Darius, ordered Daniel to be cast into the lion's den. And, he can do nothing at this moment, but he can console Daniel by saying, may God whom you serve deliver you, so this, statement that King Darius says, recognizes, Daniel's devotion to his God. And, also Darius probably has hope that, the punishment towards Daniel will fail. Now, here we see Darius had kept his word and, he ordered Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den. Now, what they did was they put him into the lion's den and they rolled a stone over the den, and then at the mouth of it, they sealed it with his signet ring. Darius seals the den, and also with the signet rings of the nobles. So Daniel had no chance, to escape, and no chance to escape death. So verse 18 says that then the king went off to his place and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. So we see here in verse 18 that the king went, to his palace. He left the den. He couldn't take it no more. He went to his palace and he didn't eat anything. He was a little worried, he was in that state of panic, worried, he was tense. Even probably, every night he had some entertainment, that was before him in the night, but he did not do any of that. He did not entertain himself. Even he was so worried that his sleep, fled from him. It's like, one of those times when somebody is really tense, you cannot eat, you cannot sleep, you cannot do anything. King Darius was in that kind of state. So as soon as the dawn broke, he headed to the lion's den in haste. And then in verse 20, it says that when he had come near to the den to Daniel, he cried out with a loud voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? So Darius, he got up, he hurried to the lion's den, and then cried out to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, you who serve God continually, are you safe from the lions? Now Darius knew that Daniel worshipped the living God, yet he was unsure if Daniel's God had the power to deliver him from the lions. Now, we also see in chapter 3, verse 17, the three Hebrew boys had said to Nebuchadnezzar that our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning furnace. And here we see that King Darius is in a position where he's actually, experienced the power of the Almighty God, and God is able to deliver Daniel from the lion's den, just as he had delivered, the three Hebrew boys from the burning furnace in chapter 3, verse 17. Then we see in verse 21 that Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. Then in verse 22, he says, My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me as much as I was found innocent before him. And also towards you, O king, I have committed no crime. So Daniel's response was he first greeted the king, and then he told Darius the reason why the lions did not harm him. It was not because the lions were not hungry, it's because an angel came and shut those mouths of the lions. And that is why Daniel was not harmed. And why did the angel do that? The reason I also mentioned in verse 22 is because Daniel, he was blameless before God and he had not committed any evil towards the king. So the Lord had rescued Daniel. Just as, the three Hebrew boys were blameless and God had used an angel to rescue them, God had used an angel to rescue. And we see that, the lions, it's not that they did not have an appetite, it is that the angels had shut their mouths. Then in verse 23, we see that the king was very pleased and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in his God. Now look at this. I want to point out one thing to you is that you know already that the law couldn't be revoked. So putting Daniel into the den was nothing could be done about that. But the law, the injunction did not state what happens if there was a survivor. Now, they had never anticipated such a scenario. So here was a survivor who was put in Daniel's den, and the law or the injunction did not state what had to be done with the survivor. So here we see King Darius, he violated his own injunction and removed Daniel from the den. He just took law into his own hands and just acted. That's what King Darius did. He did not, call the counselors. He did not call the wise men. He did not, you know, he did not ask for advice. He just acted on his own because he loved Daniel, and he knew that Daniel was doing the right thing. Now, here we see as Daniel is removed from the lions, then it's a picture of the resurrection from the dead, just as Isaac was delivered from a near sacrifice. Here we see Daniel was delivered from a near death experience. The same concept is also found in the story of Jonah. We see that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 40, and Jonah chapter 2, verse 1 and 10. Jonah chapter 2, verses 1 to 10. So here we see that even Jonah, he was almost, eaten by the big fish, but he came back. He was like almost dead, but he came back. Then in verse 24, we see the king gave orders and they brought those men who had accused Daniel and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den. And they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So look at this. These guys who are jealous, now they themselves are put into the lion's den. Not only them, but their whole family, their wives and their children also. And here we see that before they could reach the bottom, the hunger was so much of the lions that they, overpowered them and crushed their bones. These people who had, planned for the death of Daniel, they themselves, justice was brought, towards them. It's an example of, justice we see in the Old Testament. For example, in Esther chapter 7, verses 7 to 10, we see that Haman, he wanted to destroy the Jews and get rid of them. But eventually he himself was, hung. So here we see that instead of Daniel dying in the lion's den, we see these satraps and commissioners, put into the den, and they were killed and crushed into pieces. Not them only, but their families also. Then we see in verse 25 that now the king, he writes another decree, and that is to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in the land. And he says, may your peace abound among you, in verse 25. So he was saying that, let peace be multiplied to you. A typical wish, in that uh, in that culture. And then this is a decree. He says in verse 26 and 27, I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So Darius decreed that in his kingdom, all the people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. The king was so impressed by God's intervention and his protection of Daniel that he wanted everyone to respond in a way that was appropriate. He wanted them to fear the living God who rescued his servant Daniel from the lion. Now, Daniel explained his new decree that he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be forever. He had already called the Lord the living God, and now he wanted everyone to know about this deity. Now, since God endured forever, it made sense that his kingdom and dominion would last forever as well. Now, it was significant that Darius, you know, a emperor and king of some sort, you know, acknowledged that God's kingdom would endure, implying that, even his kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom, would not, go that long as much as God's kingdom would. Now we see Nebuchadnezzar, he had also made similar statements about God's kingdom in chapter 4, verse 3 and verse 34. So, so Darius, he wrote that God delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heavens and earth, in heaven and on earth. He has saved Daniel from the power of the lion. So this decree had in mind Daniel's deliverance from the den of hungry lions. So, like this, like Darius, like King or Emperor Darius, Nebuchadnezzar, also experienced God's power in God rescuing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego from the fiery furnace. And we saw that already in chapter 3, verses 28 and 29. And even Nebuchadnezzar spoke of signs and wonders in chapter 4, verse 3. And here we see in chapter 6 that God continued displaying his mighty power, over the conspirators, and they did not succeed, and therefore all should fear and tremble before the Almighty God. So here we see also in verse 28 that Daniel enjoyed the success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So Daniel, think about this, he was transported to Babylon as a teenager in 605 BC, and probably the event of the lions then occurred in 539 BC after the Medo-Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians. Now, Daniel would have been in his 80s during the reign of King Darius. Now, Daniel was following God with all that he had, and therefore, he had seen several kingdoms, and he was also an advisor to many kings of his day and age. So we see that, Daniel, he was known for not compromising. He was known for his faithfulness, especially in connection of the law of his God. We see that in chapter 6, verse 5. So before we close our class, I want to show you something, a recap of what we just did. One minute. So here we see that there is from chapter 1 to 6 is all the courtroom stories. And in those courtroom stories, there's always promotion and prospering happening. We see at the end of every chapter, there's somebody being promoted or there's somebody that's being prospered at the end of the chapter. So we finish with the first 6 chapters, and this is how it looks like. In chapter 1, in the last 2 verses, verses 19 and 20, in the last few verses, we see that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they are promoted and are prospering. Then we see the same thing in chapter 2, the last few verses. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are prospering or promoted. Then in the last verse of chapter 3, we see Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are promoted. Then in the last verse of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is promoted. Then in chapter 5, the last verse, and chapter 6, the last verse, that Daniel is being promoted. And this promotion comes with one thing, that these guys faithfully, besides Nebuchadnezzar, these guys were all, serving God with all that they had. They were they were worshiping God with everything that they had, and they were doing the best to please God in everything. So this is our class for today. So let's pray, and then we can continue from next week. From next week, we start with the prophecies of Daniel. I'll try to make it as easy as possible, but I need you guys to read chapter 7 and come next week. So this is our class for today.